What's up, marker heads? It's Karen from Art by Karen E. Haley. This tutorial is the second part of the Coloring Transparent Materials with Copic's tutorial series, and it's going to be focusing on flowing water. And I hope that you guys enjoy. Again, if this is really helpful for you, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know, and if there's something I could do better next time, also let me know, because I want to make my tutorials better, and I'm constantly trying to improve the content that I put out, because I really want to make stuff worth your guys' time. So thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned for more tutorials in the future. Once I reach 25,000 subscribers, excuse me, I will be holding another tutorial poll. Again, I'll be giving myself a little more time than I did this time around so that I can finish it without it being late. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial, and let's get started. Okay, so here is the reference that I took for this tutorial. You'll see as the illustration progresses that I didn't exactly follow the reference photo. I will openly admit that I didn't look at the reference enough for it to be completely accurate. If you're going for accuracy, it's very important to look at your reference. Spend more time looking at your reference than you are looking at your drawing, and it'll be much more accurate than the one that I did here. However, I still wanted to use this reference to give you guys the most realistic example of what flowing water looks like, and especially how it looks when it's flowing slowly enough for you to see through it. So I can still explain what the water is doing and how to illustrate it using markers. I am very out of practice using reference, so it's not going to be perfect, since this is one of the first things I've done from reference in a very long time. Keep in mind that I'm looking to educate you guys on how to draw water, not exactly how to draw this picture. I do have these reference photos posted so that you can use them to practice from. However, my goal is to teach you how to take the information and use it in your own work, whether it's photorealism or whether you are working with illustrative styles or anything like that. In this way you can create illustrations with believable water in them, so let's start sketching. The first thing that I sketched was the water source, which is the hose, and it's important to have the source of the water down before trying to guess where the water will be. What I like to do with things like creeks or maybe water fountains and things like that is I will sketch the structure before I sketch any water coming off of it. It helps me to know where everything will be coming from and what the water will be pouring over and different things like that. So having that underlying structure is really important and very helpful. So now I'm moving on to the pouring water, and when water is pouring from something, there's a lot of factors that come into play that affect the water's physics. There's the water source, the force behind the water, the gravity, which is always pulling it back down to earth, the air and air currents, which can be pushing it side to side, and the surface tension. And these are all different factors that really make up and shape the water. So it's no wonder that people struggle with water, because it has so many different factors working against it that shape this fluid subject. If you study it enough, it will be easier for you to break it down as you sketch it out. So go ahead and get a big pitcher and a bowl and pour the water and observe what the water does. See what it does when it's splashing into the bowl or when it's coming out from the spout. These are all things that I was doing when I was making reference for this tutorials, because I was really wanting to make sure I knew what I was working with. And so these are all really good ideas for you guys too, is to get some water and play around with it and see what it does. It really helps to understand the physics behind such a fluid subject. Alright, now we're thinking about the force behind the water. This picture is an example of a really low pressure, low force flowing water. This water doesn't have a lot of power behind it, so it's able to just come out of the hose and gracefully return to Earth without creating a lot of froth or bubbles or anything like that. And that's why we can see through it. If there was a lot of pressure, the water would be mixing with the air and creating bubbles and foam and different things like that, and it would be really hard to see through it, and it would also be spraying out a lot further distance away. Water is always affected by gravity, so keep in mind that it's going to seek the quickest way down. If it doesn't have a lot of force behind the water like we have here, it's going to pretty much come out of the hose and drop straight to earth, because water is always looking for the quickest way down. And when it's not meeting a lot of resistance in the air, it's just going to fall straight to earth in a nice little trickle. Okay, now that we've sketched our basic shape of the water, we need to think more about the form of the water itself. Something that's interesting that I learned while I was working on this tutorial and taking the reference photos and things like that was that I noticed the water is spiraling as it comes down through the air. I'm not sure if it is affected by the shape of the water source. I'm not sure if it's something that has to do with surface tension. In any case, it's really helpful to indicate this spiral in your drawing because it helps to give structure to this chaotic looking subject. As it flows downward because of gravity, it's also fighting against air and wind currents. As the water falls through the air, it's seeking this path of least resistance, so it's converging to a steady, narrow stream because it's able to find that straight down path through the air. But if it's windy, the stream might become curved, or it might even break up into droplets. That's just all depending on how strong the wind is. In the case of my reference, the stream wasn't affected very much by wind, but it was able to curve the stream just a little bit. You'll notice that I wind up erasing my whole sketch and redoing it, and that's something I want to remind you guys, is that it's okay if you feel like you've messed up. It's okay to erase. You have not committed to anything at this point. You're sketching, so it's totally fine if you feel like you need to erase everything and start over, just like I did here. Alright, now that we've sketched the hose and the water, the next step is to sketch the background. The background in my photo reference is divided into simple, straight areas of distinct value and color. The sky, the bushes, the driveway, and the grass. Composition-wise, it's really boring, so don't do a background like this in a finished piece if you can avoid it. It's just so flat. However, it is just right for showing how water distorts things that are seen through it, so I'm going to use it for learning purposes because it's a good, simple background to break down as water distorts the things that are behind it. Now that the sketch is all cleaned up, it's time to move on to picking out your markers. Before I start any coloring, I always make a test swatch to check and see if the colors I've grabbed are exactly the right color that I want to use. I'm always planning which colors I'm using in my pictures. It helps me to save time. If I have a list of markers that I used, it's okay for me to put my markers away and keep my desk nice and clean when I'm done working for the night. It's also very useful because you're able to go back and see which colors you used for the background when you're working with transparent objects, and that's why it's so important, especially for this type of drawing, to know which colors you used. I made a list of what colors I used for the sky, what colors I used for the bushes, the driveway, and the yard, and this way I was able to go back and use the right markers when I was working on the water. So it's really important, and I think you guys should make use of this tip. Always make a list of which markers you're using. I always start with the background when I color, and I generally work from top to bottom. I like to work in sections first, starting with the sky and then moving down that way. So in this way I worked from the sky, coloring in the main color and then adding detail, and then I did the same thing for the bushes, the driveway, and finally the yard. And afterward, I muted the colors in the distant background and part of the yard to help push those parts back a bit. This tutorial mainly focuses on the water, so I'm not going to explain the background very much. I'm not going to talk about how I did the bushes or anything like that, because we're focusing on how to draw the water. However, I will say that keeping your edges along the water nice and crisp is very important, especially if you don't use outlines. I did a lineless drawing for this because I wanted it to be very realistic looking. So keeping that edge control is vital in order to keep the form of the water intact. It also helps to have a sharp edge in order to bring it forward in space so that your eye is seeing that water looking, and it makes it look up close, and it makes the distant background look farther away. Once the scene was complete, I was able to move on to the water. At this point, distortion really comes into play, and you have to think about it a lot. The water is transparent, so you can see through it, but it isn't flat. Its surface is flowing and has a lot of movement, so the irregular surface causes what we see through it to distort and take on the shape of the water. We can still see the sky, bushes, and everything else, but the shapes are now really abstract. So all these things I needed to keep in mind as I worked in order to make the water look like water. As I colored the water, I first filled in the areas that were reflecting the sky. So I was using a light blue. It's the lightest value color that I used in the background, which means that any mistakes I made could be hidden under the darker value colors that I add later on. It's also the largest area of the color that the water is reflecting, so blocking in this large area first helps create a map for the other colors. I slowly used the side of the brush nib and covered more area and blended the ink smoothly. I also used the side of the brush nib because it saturates the paper with more ink, and it helps with part of the steps that I'm going to be doing later on. As I laid down the areas of color, I thought about how the surface of the water was spiraling downward, and I used the marker to create the shapes. And as the whole coloring progresses, keep in mind that the water doesn't make pointy shapes when it's flowing, so if you create pointed areas either in the valleys or in the peaks of your areas of color, round them off a little bit, because it sort of makes the water look frozen in a way. It gives it an icy effect that you don't really want, so make sure that any peaks or valleys of your color are going to be smooth and rounded. I noticed that as the water moved closer to the ground, only smaller patches of the sky could be seen, so I made sure to add in small patches now so they don't get colored in later. As I colored the rest of the water, these patches dried, which is good because these tiny little areas of sky were brighter highlights against darker colors. So putting them in now first reminds me that they're supposed to be there, and it also lets them dry, which will give them a sharper edge, which will create a bolder highlight. As those small patches dried, I returned to coloring the larger sky areas in the water, and I adjusted shapes. I made sure I liked how they looked, and then I colored over the blue with the Copic colorless blender. It softened any streaks and saturated the paper with even more ink, which leads into the next step. I moved on to the next color quickly while those areas of color were still wet, because coloring wet next to wet can give a soft edge where they will blend into each other a little bit. And I noticed in the reference that many of the different colors that make up the water have soft edges on them. I chose the next darkest value up from the sky color, which was the color of the dry grass, and I colored in any areas that were reflecting that color. Because I had to layer a few colors to get the right match when I colored the background, I had to use the same color combination when I colored the areas in the water. In some areas I had to blend these colors with the blue of the sky in order to kind of mute them a little bit and just blend things together, because a lot of the soft edges were really soft, really blended areas, especially as it got closer to the ground. Before these areas of color had a chance to dry, I added the last colors. This time I was focusing on the reflected areas that were the same color as the hedges, and these areas had the darkest contrast. They were the darkest colors, and so I wanted to make sure that I kept the same colors, but they still have a soft edge within the water. So I again worked in the same combination of layers that I did when I colored the background itself, by starting with that mid-tone green and then adding some of the darker colors and some of the texture of the leaves. But I still made sure to blend the edge of this dark green where its edges were sharper than I wanted it to be, because I really wanted to make sure the edges of all of the colors were softer. Using the light color of the blue helped to lighten up the dark green, so I did that partially because it helped to knock back all of that extra detail that I put in and kind of give it a watery effect, but I also did it because it created some lighter areas that gave the illusion of curved surface from the water itself. Alright, so after that I went over the whole thing a few times, tweaking soft edges here and there, blending some colors together, and making sure that the colors were the way that I wanted them to be. I also colored over the light blue with the blender in a few places in order to mute that color to show more form, more curvature of the water itself. And I also used the blender to push some edges of the darker green. I didn't really like some of the shapes that I made because I didn't feel that they were accurate enough, and so I was able to change some of the shapes by pushing that color around using the colorless blender. I noticed that I did make a sharp point in the dark green color with the colorless blender, and I did later on correct it by rounding off that shape. Like I mentioned before, having pointed shapes in your water doesn't really look right, at least to me. I don't think it looks right to have pointy areas on water, because water, it doesn't have corners, it has curves, so having pointy areas gives it kind of a corner look. Like I said, it makes me think of ice. So I try to make sure I look back and change anything that has something pointy on it. So that's part of what I was doing here, is I was checking everything to make sure it was right. Once I was satisfied with the water, I moved on to the hose so I could work on something else while the ink dried on the water. And after I finished the hose, I came back and tweaked the water again in tiny areas, sharpened some edges around the outer edge of the water, and softened some of the edges inside the water. And finally I added some highlights with a white acrylic paint and a white gel pen. And when you're adding highlights, kind of think about where the water would most likely have light hitting on it, especially like large bulging areas. Usually at some point on that arc there will be a bright highlight, and so that's what I did on the top. I put a highlight there, and then I found some other areas where light was catching. Once the highlights were dry, the picture was done, and I was so happy to do this tutorial for you guys. So I really hope that you enjoyed. Please let me know if it was helpful for you. Please give me a like, a favorite, or whatever it is that you guys do now. They change it so much, I don't even remember. And if you're interested, I do have an Etsy, I have a Facebook, and I have a DeviantArt page. I also now have an Instagram, and all of these things can be found in the description below. So please let me know what you guys thought, and again, I do apologize for how late this tutorial was, but I really wanted to make sure it was perfect for you guys, and I also went through a move in the middle of making this, so I had to take a break from it for a little while. Anyway, I hope that you guys enjoy, and I will see you guys in the next video.